Okay, good morning, welcome. Today we have Will Merrin visiting us, who's Associate Professor in Media at the University of Swansea. He's going to be talking about his book, Media Studies 2.0, which is a book which we've certainly talked about on the Media and Transition unit, and also talked about at Oakmead as well as being quite an important argument in relation not only to how media is changing, but how media studies as a discipline might not be responding as it should. So I would imagine that this morning's presentation will be provocative, that it will raise some questions. So we're going to have about up to an hour or so, and then half an hour for discussion, debate, fighting, or whatever happens. That was supposed to be funny and not going to be any fighting. Anyway, I should sit down and hand over to Will.
Thank you very much. I've learned over the past few years when I've been talking about media studies that you always get really nice introductions, but you have to be wary because you always get a real kicking at the end, and the nicer the introduction, the kind of more of a kicking you tend to get. What I'm going to do today is offer a very brief overview of kind of the idea of Media Studies 2.0 as I've got it, but then move on from it to a specific paper I'm trying to write at the moment, which I call I Fight for the User, Media Studies in the 21st Century. And for anyone who's a geek, the quote is from Tron Legacy, which I didn't finish watching, but I like the quote. In terms of media studies, this is kind of like an idea that I'm kind of basically going to commit career suicide with. I was teaching new media, as we tended to call it at the time at Swansea, and I noticed that stuff was happening every day. And I started collecting all these links and stories together on like the university virtual learning environment. But then I realized that after the end of every module, I'd lost it all. So I decided to just set up a blog in which I'd kind of put all these resources for my students. And I didn't know what to call it, and I suddenly had this brainwave and called it Media Studies 2.0, and I set out an opening kind of like introduction on the blog about what was changing and how we needed to rethink the discipline. After which I never really wrote anything more other than putting kind of links to a kind of news stories. And the idea was that I would write more, but there was too much happening, and each month I could barely keep up with the volume of changes in every aspect of digital media. So in the end, the blog just became a link dump, and in the end, I got sick of it. But by then, there kind of somebody came to the rescue. Professor David Gauntlet had come up with a very similar, well, the same idea essentially, and had gone Googling to see if anyone else had used it and found me. And he was kind enough to kind of reference my kind of prior use of it. And most people obviously then came to know of the concept through David Gauntlet. And there's a lot of things in common in terms of the idea, the focus on like, you know, the kind of, well, the empowered user and producer especially. But I think there's a lot of differences between me and David especially. And I always wanted to kind of set out a kind of a vision of what I thought to kind of the issues were. And I started it in 2009 in an article. And after kind of life kind of got in the way for a few years, I kind of came back to it for a book which has just come out. But I always knew from the start when I had the idea that this wasn't just a glib phrase, which is often how it can be easily interpreted. I had a complete vision. I'm not saying the vision is right, I'm simply saying that I had a kind of coherent idea which I wanted to put together. I had a view of the history of media, of how it related to kind of media studies and the history of media studies. I had a view of what had actually changed, and I had certain arguments about what that meant for media studies. And very simply, in terms of the history of media, it was quite obvious from everything I was reading and from the changes I was watching that something called broadcasting, or the broadcast model, or the broadcast era was kind of coming rather rapidly to an end. And traditionally, we kind of trace the beginnings of broadcasting in media to 1450s and Gutenberg. In my book, I kind of suggest that actually broadcasting is a kind of cultural process, and there's earlier examples written. The Catholic Church especially can be seen as a kind of broadcast medium predating Gutenberg. But traditionally we've seen like the rise of printing, followed by the rise of print culture, newspapers, printed images. Photography for a while was a kind of broadcast form in the 19th century. Music, which was kind of turned into a commodity and broadcast. Radio, cinema, television. What we have is a kind of whole range of kind of media historically developed through these centuries, built around or kind of moving to a kind of commercial broadcast model based upon mass production for mass distribution and mass consumption. And in the book, I kind of spend a lot of time talking about this broadcast model and how it was top down and kind of, you know, how it was kind of like pre-filtered into certain genres and kind of targeted at certain demographics, and most people were merely kind of audiences and receivers instead of active producers, etc. But essentially there was a kind of an entire history of broadcasting, if you like, and broadcast media. And one of kind of the ideas I had, which seems to me to be blindingly obvious, but somehow it kind of becomes controversial. I said that, well, what we call media studies is a product of the broadcast era. And in that sense, I would also argue it's kind of reflection of it in many ways. You can trace a lot of kind of growing debates around sociology, philosophy in the late 19th century around the topic of communication. And of course, communication is becoming an issue then, because you've got, particularly in America, the rise of the kind of the railways, the kind of telegraph, the telephone, and the kind of industrialization of newspapers. But really, kind of the origins of modern media studies lies in around the 1920s, when mass communication has become extremely, they've taken on a kind of different level, if you like, of production and consumption in terms of the kind of mass circulation daily newspapers, the rise and success of radio. Film has become a global industry by the 1920s, and it caused a problem. You can see there's a kind of historical kind of period of disruption where people are kind of thinking, what the hell's going on and what's the problems these are causing? So particularly kind of film, etc., there were kind of issues around the impact of film and whether or not it was kind of destroying the nation's morals, etc. There were kind of questions about, you know, how do kind of mass media shape public opinion, and what implications does that have for democracy? All these debates of the 1920s, most of which are kind of speculative by particular authors, Bernays, Lippmann, etc. By the 1930s, you've got the kind of the origins of kind of really of kind of university-based academic empirical work into mass media through the Chicago School, through studies into kind of films, etc. And in the 1940s, Paul Lazarsfeld basically kind of invents media studies as kind of an academic discipline. The 1939 is an important era when the Rockefeller Foundation gathers together some of the most important kind of media academics in America and has a special communication seminar, and they produce a famous memorandum in 1940. I say famous because it's actually the founding document of modern media studies, and you can almost not find it, and almost no one's heard of it. But it's this kind of famous communication seminar where they set out media studies as being concerned with kind of who says what to whom with what effect, and they begin to set out the kind of the methodologies appropriate to each section. The idea of the Rockefeller Foundation kind of seminar was to kind of tell the American government that media could be a kind of important science and contribute towards propaganda in the war effort. And they were taken up on that kind of role in the kind of America in the Second World War. And many mass communication scholars worked for the American government, helping them to kind of understand propaganda and the process of media. And in the post-war period, you get a kind of huge period of kind of American government, military, and CIA funding of media studies departments or journalism and media kind of departments and research centers in America. Many of these are funded by the American military, American CIA, etc., in order to produce work that would help in the kind of Cold War and propaganda in the Third World. Media studies has an odd origin in terms of its relationship both with the industries that fund it and the governments that fund it. It's a kind of ideological complicity we never really talk about enough. But media studies then was a product of the broadcast era. All these mass media turned up and we begin to study them. But in terms of what it became, it was also a kind of reflection of the broadcast era. This is a bit hard to get your head around, but one way we can see this is in teaching, where teaching, certainly through the kind of, by the end of the 20th century, had kind of split off. And if we see this in terms of media literacy, that normally involves concepts of reading and writing. That's what literacy is. And in terms of kind of what we have structurally in media studies, we live in a broadcast era, or lived in a broadcast era in which only a minority could produce, and the mass of people were essentially there just simply consuming and reading media. And media studies reflected that dichotomy. We would actually teach you media writing, basically practical modules, how to produce radio, television, journalism, in the hope that some of you will go into the industry and take part in that minority of producers. And as such, you could argue, and this is slightly controversial, that the main aim of teaching production skills was to serve industry, or at least to get students skills so that they could be employed. Equally though, we taught reading skills. There was a kind of theoretical media studies which was very much concerned with how do we understand the media? What can we teach people about media? How does it work? How does it work upon you? How do we read text? How do we interpret? Essentially, can we actually kind of give kind of the students, the massive consumers, the skills to protect against mass media? And that's a weird kind of little division, a kind of schizophrenia in the discipline between one side saying let's serve industry and the other side saying as consumers you need to be protected against it and understand it. But there was also a theoretical reflection of the broadcast era in theoretical media studies. For the most part, most of mass media studies is concerned with about 4 or 5 media forms really. They barely do music. They really don't do print culture very well. We don't do books or literature, that's English. We do newspapers, radio, cinema and television. And for the most of media studies, those 4 main broadcast forms dominated. We also focused on a kind of linear communication model and process. We weren't really concerned with media or technology. We were concerned with the process of communication. And there is a kind of famous linearity here, which it's there from the beginning in the Rockefeller Foundation memorandum where they said who says what to whom with what effect. There's a kind of linearity of a message is created with a meaning that is sent and interpreted. And this becomes an important part of media studies. In 1948, the University of Illinois, where Wilbur Schramm, the communication scholar is, manages to get Claude Shannon's book, Mathematical Theory of Communication, published. It's important, it's published by a media studies professor and kind of department really. Because Shannon has all this idea of kind of here's a kind of information kind of source and then you kind of encode it and transmit it and it's received at the end. And this scientific model of communication fitted in perfectly with a kind of broadcast mindset. Because that's what happens in broadcasting. Big company makes a message, chucks it at the people, they receive it. And there's no feedback, there's no reciprocity. This is why Wiener was kind of like, in a sense, kind of not important for media studies. But Claude Shannon was. And immediately you can prove the influence of this because immediately Lippmann in 1948 publishes an essay where we suddenly have who says what to whom through what channel. And that little cybernetic kind of Shannon kind of idea reappears to what effect. To kind of upon what audience, etc. So this linearity has always been part of media studies. And in a sense, a lot of media lecturers have learnt to kind of take part in that linearity. What do you do? I study production. What do you do? I study some form of content. I'm a TV scholar, I do film studies. Or I study audiences, I study fans. Not everybody locates themselves simply within that, but broadly speaking, you can at least see that there is a kind of sense in which a lot of people in the discipline do, and a lot of kind of versions of the discipline do this. And we also kind of interpreted the broadcast era through key categories, such as the audience. Now, last time I gave a paper on this at Birmingham, somebody picked me up on this and said, this is utter rubbish. He was a famous professor, and he said he'd been in the discipline from the start. He said, it's utter rubbish. You know, I don't recognise your vision of media studies. All this linear communication model is utter bunkum. I don't do this at all. Then he led me back to his office, and he showed me his book. And I just flicked open the contents page. It says, part 1, histories. Okay, I'm good with history. Part 2, industries and production, okay? Part 3, form, meaning and representation. Part 4, audiences and consumption. I said to him, this is the broadcast model. You've actually produced a text that reflects the broadcast era and model of production. Because you've got a bit of background history. Then you've got industry and production, meaning and interpreter and content, audiences and what they make about it. You practically reproduce it. And he was kind of like slightly annoyed to find that this was kind of being kind of pointed out to him because he hadn't seen it. But then as Marshall McLuhan says, you know, the last person who discovered water was a fish. So maybe the same is true for media lecturers. In terms of what changed, I do like Lev Manovich, his simple idea that digital media is essentially the convergence of 2 different trajectories, 2 different historical kind of processes, the rise of mass media and the rise of computing. I like this because it suggests there is a revolutionary moment, which is when they converge and when that convergence tips and takes off. It doesn't deny a history, because there's a history of computing and a history of mass media, but there is still a kind of revolutionary period in which essentially something happens, computing really kind of merges with mass media. Manovich talks about this as a convergence. I think something more is going on. There's a digital phagy. There's a kind of eating, a consumption of mass media by digitality. But it's a strange one because we don't notice it. There was a great, I think it was Steve Wright, an American comedian in the 1980s. I remember watching on television, he had a joke, and he said, I came home to find I'd been burgled, and everything I owned had been replaced by identical objects. I remember hearing that joke thinking, wow, okay, well he obviously hasn't been burgled. Then you start thinking, what if he has? What if he has and it's all been replaced by identical objects? And then you're into kind of Philip K. Dick territory. But in a strange sense, that's what digital technology does. It replaces everything with identical objects. So if you're a film scholar, well, it's just a DVD of your film with a few more extras, and it's up on YouTube and there's an Easter egg. It's just more film. And you don't have to deal necessarily with the underlying processes. I would argue that you do. In order to explain the concept of kind of the digital revolution in the book, I kind of, to help students and kind of explain in detail, show the complexity of it, I divided up 4 parts to a revolution. There's more, there's as many as you can find. But first of all, I wanted to argue there's a kind of physical material revolution where that which was analog and built into certain separate forms becomes essentially digital computational technologies. There's an ecological revolution where we see the entire media ecosystem has to be remade by the fact that these computational technologies are now at the bottom of everything. New technology companies rise, new ways of doing things arise, new relationships arise. There's a kind of like spreading out effect through the whole ecosystem, remaking all sorts of layers and relationships. Something I called a cultural revolution is really a kind of economic and political revolution as well. The passage from a particular model of broadcasting where a minority or a large company invests huge resources to mass produce, mass distribute for mass consumption, to a very different era in which we have a much more complex set of possibilities at an individual and a kind of a macro level. And I also introduced a kind of idea of a personal revolution and something I call media with a hyphen, because what we have is essentially this weird experience in which suddenly the whole media ecology revolves around us. So back when I was a kid, you basically had to be sitting in front of TV, BBC One at 6:15 on Saturday night, or you missed Doctor Who and you'd never see it. Now I can find it in any form I like, whether it's kind of legal from the DVD, illegal from all sorts of things, including kind of watching it up on YouTube, etc. There's a sense in which I control, like the master kind of panel, if you like, of my experiences. And I can control what I want, and I've got my own little range of experiences. In the morning when I wake up, what I check online on my phone is different from what you check on your phone and online, etc. And this includes even the way in which we pull in kind of broadcast media. I will watch Game of Thrones, although I'll illegally download it. I'm not going to get involved in that TV show Breaking Bad because I couldn't be bothered. But someone else has a completely different set of relationships. That kind of fragmentation is well known, but I like the idea that in some sense it revolves centrally around us now. And I made a point of trying to call this a revolution because this is still a controversial term in many ways, although I've given papers where people have said, well, we know it's a revolution, so why are you doing that? And I think, well, some people still argue about it. But I like the idea that essentially we don't focus enough on the materiality. One technological form basically swallowed almost all others to a greater or lesser extent. Not completely, but to a greater or lesser extent. The scale and speed at which this has happened is also important. You could look at like the history of the invention of writing, the invention of images. We don't know enough about the invention, but we can guess that the way in which it kind of took over kind of older forms, such as what was in the head, probably took thousands of years, generations at the least. And what we have here is a kind of digital revolution that, whichever way you look at it, is seriously kind of like little over a few decades in terms of the tipping point, from when kind of computational technologies became popular to the point at which they've pretty much swallowed up nearly every other medium. And that's why I'd argue that we need a kind of similar revolution in how we think. And this is against an idea which is kind of easy in the discipline, that it's really just an evolution, and that the same ideas still work, they just need a bit of tweaking. And I don't think they do. I think, if anything, as a kind of good old, still a bit of a McLuhanist and Baudrillardian, I think we always need to push further. And an example of this is the concept of audience, because we still use the concept of audience when we deal with kind of digital kind of experiences. And I don't think the concept of audience works. Why I don't like the audience is because historically it's been a kind of major part of culturalism, and the idea, following kind of Hall originally with encoding, decoding, that in the linear communication model, the really key determinant process is at the end. Because if your message doesn't flow in the way you want and someone takes something different from it, then your message has failed. Therefore, the key determinant process is really the audience. And this got inflated. What was for Stuart Hall a kind of political struggle, which we could lose got inflated slightly into a sense in the discipline of a kind of like an orthodoxy, that the audience was always active and always kind of won. And I never really believed that. Coming from different traditions, particularly sociology, I've always been more towards structure than agency, and I've always been more interested in the ways in which actually kind of structures attempt to kind of change us and influence us. And for me, media studies kind of drifted off into a kind of rather simplistic, naive humanism, which didn't really admit of any form of influence, whether it's social, cultural, economic, or technological. But what happened was they kind of leapt upon digital technology and then kind of claimed it as being almost a realization of what they were doing. You've got the active audience, and then you've got fans, and then fans are online, and then we're all online and we're all kind of fans. So therefore everyone online is kind of linked back to the active audience. So we're all active audiences. And it's like, Henry Jenkins plays a kind of key role in this transition. He points back to his earlier books saying, this is a realization of what we were talking about in the 1990s. We move from active audiences to fans to users. And I don't believe it. And I'm going to hopefully show you why it's wrong. Liam Stacey probably is a name that you might remember or might not, but it's probably more important for me. This is a guy who basically sent racist Twitter abuse around the incident when the Bolton Wanderers footballer collapsed with a heart attack on the pitch. And he said some things which were rather bad, and people confronted him, and he sent lots of racist abuse on Twitter, and basically got jailed for 56 days in 2012. And why I noticed this is because the news suddenly said he's a Swansea University student. And I basically crapped myself. I thought, oh God, if this is media, we're in trouble. So I had to check all my student lists. Luckily, he wasn't a media student, he was a biology student. But he got sent down for 53 days, 56 days, I'll have to check that. And he said afterwards it was a stupid, massive mistake, and I've paid a big price for it. What I struggled to get my head around was a week or two before, I was just a normal kid, getting on with my work in university, getting on with life, playing rugby with all my mates. Then a week or two later, I was just going to prison. Everything had been turned upside down. And it's an interesting kind of moment. For me, it was a bit of a wake-up moment. It was a point at which you suddenly think, yeah, your students might not turn up today, not because they've got a hangover, but because they're in prison. And that's slightly different from what we've ever experienced before. And I think we've kind of got to deal with that in some sense as a discipline. Because this is a world where essentially one of the major shifts is this kind of productive term where everyone is a producer. And that wasn't true in the broadcast era. If I'd have gone into school, having written down all my thoughts for the day and kind of drawn pictures of my breakfast and tried to show them to my mates, I would have been bullied. I was bullied anyway, but I would have been bullied for that specifically. That would have been an insane thing to do. If I'd have drawn comics, if I'd have kind of tried to make a TV program and shown my mates, they'd have thought it's a quaint thing to do, but there was no cultural value in amateur production except within very small limits and very small kind of groups, maybe the fanzine market, for example. But that's different, because today everyone's a producer. Everyone has their phones and their technologies. They're all online. We're all on platforms. Throughout the whole day, we're producing content. And one of the kind of moments when this was driven home to me was when my 10-year-old son was 10 years old at the time, and he came up to me and said, can I have a YouTube channel? And I said, no, you can't, sod off. Why do you need a YouTube channel? You're 10, for God's sake. I want to talk to my mates. And I said, here's an idea. Go into school, open your mouth. Talk to your mates. He said, no, I want to talk to my mates online. And he kind of started screaming about this. I had to hit him for a while till we both calmed down. And then I said, okay, I'll set up a YouTube channel for you. And I realized there was already a channel associated with that account. And I called him in and I said, have you got a YouTube channel? He goes, no, yes. Okay, how long have you had that? Dunno, yesterday. Okay, right, now we're getting somewhere. And he'd had a sleepover the night before with his mate, and basically they'd been watching videos on YouTube, and then there was this light bulb moment where they said, let's make one. They'd set up a channel, and then Googled, how do you make a YouTube video? And this animation app came up, and they simply downloaded the animation app and made a video, which was an argument between a fizzy drink and a hamburger. And I played this, and I thought it was in Spanish, because I couldn't understand it, till I realized I'd had to type in the dialogue. And primary schools these days don't correct English and grammar, etc., so they have no ability to actually spell, which is why you couldn't quite work out what it said. But basically what they typed in was an argument between a fizzy drink and a hamburger, with one going, F you, and F you too, you B, and whatever. And it was all just obscene. So my 10-year-old son had basically posted an obscene video to the entire world. Which wasn't what I expected him to be doing on a sleepover. You know, maybe this is a bit naive as a media lecturer, but I still thought, well, how could he do that without a camera? Oh my God. And of course, he'd also, just in case, he'd set up his account under the name The Hardcore Sniper. I thought that was good. In case anyone's frightened, his profile picture was a cow in sunglasses, smiling with the tagline, "Hello, sexy." So there was a whole world going on here that I'd suddenly discovered. And you suddenly think, yeah, something's happening. You know, it's like Mr. Jones and you don't really know what it is. We're users and producers, and if my 10-year-old son has more productive and distributive power than the BBC had when I was 10 years old, something's important. Something important has changed. Now, his work isn't as important as the BBC, obviously, but it was to him. And all he cared about was just making his mates laugh, and so the value actually doesn't even come into it. The audience level doesn't even come into it. It simply was a shift in value whereby he didn't care, he'd done it, he was having fun. So what I'm arguing is that we have a world of users, not audiences. How do you justify that? Well, if you look at the different histories of the concepts of user and audience comes from ordeal, it comes from kind of the concept of a legal hearing in person, and it kind of follows through receptive traditions of kind of listening to public speeches, being in a theatre, etc., before finally it's kind of like applied to kind of mediated hearings such as kind of radio, etc. But the key of it is that every concept of audience is a receptive one, whereas a user comes out of debate specifically around tool use. By the 1930s, it's related to drugs and drug use, but then by the 1940s, early computer pioneers begin to refer to it in terms of the relationship with one particular tool, which is the computer. Vannevar Bush's essay on the Menex, for example, talks about the user. And once you actually follow that tradition, you find something different. In every discussion of the user is inseparable from technology, existing in a very close system with it. You can't discuss the user without discussing the technology. Clearly, that's something that media studies has managed to avoid by focusing on the audience. In a sense, we kind of marginalize or kind of erase technology from many of our discussions. The user is also an active process rather than simply a receptive one. Reception was active in the sense of you got to choose to turn on the TV, but really most of your choices are around modes of reception and how loud the TV was, for example. The user is also designed into the tool or technology from the start, which means that they're not free and they're not undetermined, unlike this kind of humanistic concept of the audience. When they invented the PC, they invented the PC user. What you can do with any technology depends upon what they've designed for you to do, plus the one area of tension, which is what can you think of as doing with it? What's your skill level? How far can you change it and make it do something else? To give an example of the difference between an audience and user, we tend to think too easily that we're audiences even online. We watch videos or films, so we have to be audiences. Well, when you drive, you watch the road. 90% of driving is basically being a road audience, because that's safe. But you still don't call the car driver a road audience, because the key point is the level at which that individual is kind of bonded with the technology physically and is controlling all the experiences around them. And that's why even on YouTube and even watching films on your computer, you're still not quite an audience. There's been a shift there that's important. If nothing else, it's conceptually important to shift to the concept of user, because it makes us think in a different way towards our relationship with technology. Most importantly, the user is accountable. And this is really what I want to bang on about. The audience, for the most part, had anonymity. In a mass audience, most record companies, TV studios didn't really know who was using their product, what they made of it, what they thought of it, etc. There were ways of guessing, like audiences, or you could tell how many kind of records were sold, or you could kind of like, set up equipment in people's homes and then kind of like work out from that sample how many people watch TV with audience appreciation index, etc. But most of it was guesswork, because for the most part, the broadcast industry didn't know what you did with your products and didn't know what you thought about them. When you bought a record, they didn't know if it was your favourite one and you played it over and over, or if you chucked it in the bin instantly, or got a cigarette and made a little ashtray out of it for drugs, etc., which obviously is illegal. But they didn't know, the point was. Whereas with the user, the digitally connected user, the key point here is, for us at least, we are permanently connected with information flowing backwards and forth, which means that we're individually harvestable, trackable, traceable, and personally accountable. And why we need to focus on the user is because of the threats. We have a huge range of threats against the individual today. Every technology we connect to, and everything we connect to through those technologies, has a way of storing our data and organizing our data, keeping our data. We connect through ISPs or phone service providers. We've got the technology company making the device, such as kind of like a kind of Android device or kind of, you know, the kind of Samsung, etc., or the Apple, in which these companies are kind of, these phones are kind of connecting back to their kind of owners and kind of receiving updates, etc. We've got all the software developers we use, every app that we put on our phones, etc. And we also have obviously every online platform and service we use through these devices. All of these are involved in some form of data gathering. It could be automatic. Every time you go on Amazon, they know that you've been on and they keep a track of it automatically. That may not be so bad, but it kind of is. Then there's acquisitive data gathering. How many of you here have an Android phone with a Facebook app on? Right. And you're happy with the terms of service? You clicked on the terms of service saying yes. Because when you clicked on those terms of service, you said that Facebook can read all your texts and every multimedia message that you send. It's there in the terms of agreement. You click that Facebook can look at all your texts. But we don't know that, because we don't read these things. And you don't expect Facebook to be going through your text, but the fact is they do. And this is acquisitive data gathering. Now, if I said to you, for example, I'm going to come round, knock on your house tonight, and I said to you, can I come in, sit in your home and just watch you and take notes on you forever? You'd all kind of think, no. And I said, okay. What if I told you which Game of Thrones character you were? Oh, come in. Come in, I really need to know. Oh, I think you're Ned Stark. That's amazing, I thought so too. Now, sit on my sofa forever. You'd kind of think that was a bit weird, but it's what we do every day. In exchange for simply finding out which Game of Thrones character you are, you give that app developer permanent access to everything on your profile, all your contacts, all your personal information, everything you post. And you may not know that, but it's there in all the kind of details, but you can also unsubscribe to that. Do your little quiz, then go back into settings and just click goodbye for that app, and you can get rid of it. But we don't do it, because all the impetus is on us, all the emphasis is on us. We have got to kind of get involved with this management of our own lives and security, and it's kind of too much. So there is all the means of acquisitive data gathering that go on. We also have voluntary data submission. Several years ago, there was a kind of joke video about the CIA, about how they had this great idea called Facebook. And instead of spying on people, they just basically get everyone to put their own information online for them. Like crowdsourcing, you know, the Stars has got nothing on this. And it was a joke, and I remember watching this going, ho, ho, ho. Then the Snowden revelations come out, and you think, yeah, okay. We happily give all these companies all of our information. This is slightly worrying. Now, we also have problems. The user is also a threat from legal authorities and employers. We have personal responsibility for every post we make, every comment we make, and we've seen a rise in criminal cases surrounding social media use in particular. Now, some of this clampdown and sentencing is really interesting. So you can be done, for example, Asma Ahmed, 19-year-old, was basically prosecuted for grossly offensive communications because he put on a Facebook page, he put, "All soldiers should die and go to hell." Now, clearly this was a young British Muslim. He has probably got a reason for saying that, and it may be partly, an extremist reason perhaps for many people, but it could also be a very valid political reason. But instead of debating it with him, we simply sent him off to court for grossly offensive stuff. 2003 Communications Act, Section 127, which came about before we even had MySpace, which is an interesting historical kind of context for it, declares that you can't send through an electronic communications network anything that's grossly offensive. What's grossly offensive? Because ironically, kind of Jeremy Clarkson seems to be grossly offensive, and that's an electronic communications network. And he says things about, he used the N-word, for example. Why, instead of Liam Stacey, doesn't Jeremy Clarkson go to prison for 56 days? I'm sure we might all support that. But the thing is that somehow we're kind of coming down harder on social media, because this is almost a kind of political issue. So, for example, the British liberal press, most of the press, a few years ago, were horrified when Putin's government sentenced Pussy Riot kind of protesters to 2 years in prison in Russia for just having a little protest in a church. That's obviously clearly terrible. However, in Britain, 4 people were sentenced to 4 years each for putting on Facebook during the English riots, "Let's have a riot near us." And no riots happened. So they didn't even have a protest or riot, nothing actually happened. They got 4 years for doing that on Facebook. Now, we also have employers who are picking up on the fact that, people are damaging their reputation, etc. 16-year-old Essex girl got fired for posting about her new job on Facebook saying it was, quote, boring. That was enough to get her fired. A few weeks ago, there was a university lecturer at Nottingham University who had stuff up on his Facebook page, and some students realised they could see it. And it was stuff like, the marking fairy hasn't been this Christmas. Who hasn't done that? But no, it's on the student newspaper. Lecturer brags about not marking. And you kind of think he has now obviously had to leave his position, but this is a level of kind of surveillance and kind of accountability that is also quite dangerous. Employers are increasingly turning against us in this kind of area as well. Third threat to the user is the state security and intelligence services. We don't need to say too much about this, but however kind of paranoid we may have been in the past, 2013 was the year when we found out for absolute certainty that the NSA and GCHQ especially were pretty much harvesting up to 80% of the world's internet-based communications. And at the time, people kind of referred to this in terms of George Orwell in 1984, and it isn't. Because George Orwell's 1984 was about your country spying on you, one country spying on you. The 20th century was when you feared your own government. In the 21st century, every government is getting information about you. It's a global issue, it's a global problem. And they can circumvent legal issues about this. If GCHQ want information, instead of kind of going through the courts, etc., they just ask the NSA, who pick it up from Facebook where you all put it, because that's on American servers. There's ways of circumventing legal processes here. But basically, this was a set of revelations that we should have been debating throughout the entire press, and we didn't. Why is it only The Guardian and a few of the newspapers made a bit about this? Well, on, I think it was about June the 8th, 1913, the government issued a DA notice, what used to be called a D notice, telling pretty much the entire British press, please downplay this story. And they did. Which is why you had a debate about this in America, and debates in Germany when they found out Angela Merkel's phone had been bugged. In Britain, no, not at all. We had a little bit of theatre where the GCHQ and intelligence services were kind of like interrogated by the MPs who oversee them. And apparently one journalist said that after this kind of piece of theatre had happened, the MPs on the panel filed out. And one of them, who's kind of supposedly in charge of looking after what GCHQ does, was heard talking to another panel member saying, what's an ISP? These are the people overseeing the intelligence and security services. We also have the threat of cyber criminals. When I used to watch television, nobody was trying to steal my identity and steal my money. When I was listening to the phone or kind of, picking up the phone and calling my mates, nobody was attempting to kind of put any kind of virus into me whatsoever. Clearly there is a kind of a security issue that we face that we didn't have in the era of mass media. Hacking, phishing, malware, data and identity theft. We could be running as part of a botnet, we could have ransomware thrown at us, and we don't even have to kind of be compromised in our own kind of data. Anything you put online in another company, such as recent kind of revelations over eBay being hacked, means that our information is insecure even when we haven't got it. So there's a whole range of threats that come from cyber criminality. Then there's also kind of our own legal activities also get us into trouble. And there was a case a few years ago, 2009, a woman was estranged from her husband and she changed her Facebook status to single. And the estranged husband killed her because of it. In January 2014, a young girl in India defriended somebody from her class and he came round to her house and poured boiling water on her face. Now this is perfectly legal behaviour to kind of change your Facebook status, but this can still impact upon your lives and relationships. It's well known now that, kind of divorce cases increasingly cite Facebook. Many people point to Facebook and social media as causing strains in relationships. This is all perfectly legal behaviour that impacts upon us. The rise of humiliation online, revenge porn, the 20-year-old girl who said, what's our president, she's an English girl, what's our president Barack Obama doing, etc., was widely mocked throughout the whole press and on Twitter. And basically all she was somebody who kind of didn't know very much, but the kind of level of humiliation that was possible there was quite remarkable. Even things like Slain Girl recently was a kind of young woman who inadvisedly decided to basically have oral sex with a man in the middle of an Eminem concert, and was obviously filmed, and this was all over the internet and all over the news as a result. Women who eat on tubes, you're just sitting there having a snack because you can't afford to eat in London. What happens? Some idiot's putting you on a blog. So the range of kind of threats to the user are quite considerable. They don't even have to be made public. So for example, a couple of months ago in April, there was a drug dealer who was convicted, and what was interesting was the police didn't really have any evidence till they looked at his phone, and he'd taken lots of selfies of himself posing with all his cannabis, and that was pretty much enough to send him down. There was one interesting case of a girl who was 19, thought her 19-year-old boyfriend was cheating on her. So she went through his phone and found videos of him having sex with her dog. It wasn't even made public, clearly. He wasn't posting this anywhere. He's now on the sex offenders register as a result of it. He hadn't made it public. Everything we do can potentially be a threat that comes back to us. And it's worth just making this clear. This was not the case in the era of the audience. This was not the case in the era of broadcasting. So, given this, what we have to ask is, what do we need? What kind of skills and teaching do we need in the 21st century to help us? And I would argue we need two sets of skills. We need to maximize our expressive skills. We need to kind of know better than ever before the technologies and methods of how to produce and how to have an effect. But we also need a range of defensive skills for our own protection. In terms of practical skills that we need today, we still need professional competency. I'm an old kind of academic, and I don't believe that you should actually kind of go to education to be trained to do a job. I hate the idea that kind of my students will kind of like have to get a job because of what I do. I want them to have employment, but for me it's not the aim of education. But I've kind of rationalized this, and I've come to a kind of rapprochement with kind of practice in a very simple way, in the fact that I still want my students to have professional level abilities to produce information and share information. And if they want to get a job with it in the industry, that's fine. But essentially, for me, it's a case of there may come a day, there may come a time, like the activists in Tunisia and Syria found out, when you will need to be able to produce a message and share it to the best of your ability. And there's an important kind of empowerment here in terms of not just being able to do it in an amateur way, but having as much of a kind of professional competency as possible. Beyond that, what we don't teach is a whole range of amateur platforms, services, technologies, all the ways in which we can teach each other to do stuff. This is not part of traditional media practice in universities, but it's a really important part of what we could all learn, the stuff that's available for free, the kinds of technologies you can get. You can get mobile phones which have got higher definition than most of our tellies, etc., or television cameras. Then we need to know how to use this. We need to know what's available. We need to share this kind of information. But there's also an argument, if you're going to actually talk about literacy, which is about writing, then you also need to know how to code. Douglas Rushkoff, program will be programmed. The choice is simple. Program will be programmed, choose a form when you gain access to the control panel of civilization. Computers and networks finally offer us the ability to write, and we do write with them on our websites, blogs, and social networks. But the underlying capability of the computer era is actually programming, which almost none of us know how to do. We simply use the programs that have been made for us and enter our text in the appropriate box on the screen. We teach kids how to use software to write, but not how to write software. This means they have access to the capabilities given them by others, but not the power to determine the value-creating capabilities of these technologies for themselves. As Lawrence Lessig said, code is law. If you can set up the basic architecture by which people actually have kind of their ability to talk, etc., and you own that architecture, then essentially you have a level of power and control which is slightly invisible but very effective. One way of removing that is learning to code. But this is a problem. When you try and tell people this in media studies, they go, well, yeah, but you couldn't kind of teach media and teach coding to media students, and they wouldn't be able to do it, and etc. Maybe that's true. Maybe what we need is a kind of generation to come through who've already done some of it, and then we can begin to combine media and computing. But if we think about Manovich, if digital media is media and computing, you can't merge the two and then just have media studies. You have to merge the two and have computing and media studies, or else you've missed the point. Ironically, there was an era when kids did learn coding. In the early 1980s, when you got your ZX Spectrum home, you plugged it in, all you had was a little blinking cursor. And it did nothing until you made it do something. And a generation of British kids learned a form of coding and kind of shared games and swapped this, etc., and learned how to produce for themselves. And why that disappeared is because of the graphic user interface. All of a sudden, by the kind of mid-1980s, you've got kind of Windows icon, menu pointer, and lots of things you just click on. You didn't need to know how to code. And that enabled the entire democratization of computing to the point where now we can use anything and do anything really easily. But we lost something. Should we get it back? That's an open debate to have. Beyond practical forms of skills and literacy, we have theoretical literacy. What kind of reading skills or understanding skills do we need today? Well, we need whatever it takes to understand and navigate the digital ecology in a way that enables us to be able to express ourselves most fully and protect ourselves most fully. And just as an idea of the kind of modules we should be putting on, we should be teaching our kids what is digital technology? How does it work? How do you actually get inside a device? What do these devices do? How do you actually find a way to determine what they're doing? We don't even know that. New forms of digital business models, concepts of digital labour, how the kind of new global operation of companies runs. Media law should be part of every kid's media studies experience. Surveillance, censorship, control, new forms of regulation, issues of privacy, copyright sharing, forms of data visualization, data journalism. Citizen journalism obviously is still part of media studies in a little way. Citizen militancy is a kind of, certainly isn't, and I would like it in there. And the whole question of digital politics and the transparency movement. And I've been talking about media studies at various departments over the years, either giving papers or desperately asking for jobs. And I show kind of lists of stuff like this. And I kind of sit there thinking, yes, everyone must realise that this is the way that you basically got to have these modules in the future, or something better than that, or further on than that. And what I don't realise is people are actually sitting there thinking, no, we're not doing that. I couldn't teach that. We've got 10 people in the department and they're all doing texts. They know about semiology and film. They couldn't suddenly teach law. Well, so what do we do? What do we do seriously as media studies? Do we still teach then, simply because this is the staff we've got? Or do we try and get in the stuff that our students need and that the actual world is about? What I'd argue, interestingly, or maybe not that interestingly, is in the broadcast era, theory and practice had a slightly competitive relationship. One served industry, one tried to defend against it. If you reorient media studies around the user, you actually have a much more sympathetic relationship between theory and practice, because it gets down to a kind of project of how we actually kind of help the user to produce and to defend themselves. And in order to kind of see what kind of spirit I think we need for the kind of, to kind of understand the user and help them, I'd suggest 3 particular movements. One is the spirit of hackers. Hackers in the traditional sense focused on having real knowledge and technological skills. They believed in the right to tinker, to open up and try. It's like modern cars these days, like the iPhone. You can't even get inside it or else you'll invalidate warranties, etc. We should be allowed to get inside stuff. We should be allowed to find out how it works and change it. They believed in the spirit of informational freedom and sharing in an almost libertarian or anarchist way. The other movement, which is worth media studies investing in, are the cypherpunks. From 1992 onwards, these are a bunch of right-wing nutters. They were insane because they believed they were libertarian, right-wing, anti-state, the kind of people who would normally kind of build big bunkers out in the hills and fill it with guns. But what they said was, the government's spying on all our communications. They were clearly mad. Why would the government be spying on people's emails? They were derided at the time. But it's this idea that from cyberpunk, they emphasised ciphers, cypherpunks. They focused on strong cryptography. From 1992, they began publishing on email lists and various manifestos. Cypherpunks Manifesto, the Cyphernomicon you can find. The belief in individual privacy through encryption versus state surveillance. And they said in one of their manifestos, what do cypherpunks do? Cypherpunks write code. Well, they did, because they could. But what they started doing was trying to write encryption technologies that they could use against the state. And a lot of them, like pretty good privacy, come out of these kind of models and ideas. But basically what they thought was that the state and the market aren't going to help you. The companies and the government have no incentive to give you the means to cover your own identity and information, so you have to make it for yourself. And that's what they did. They tried to actually write the code that would kind of produce the technologies to defend people. Maybe one aim of media studies should be that we're writing the technologies that defend ourselves. But even if we can't do that, we should be agitating for uncrackable encryption as standard across every web connection and every web transaction. The third movement we need to look towards is the hacktivists. Hacktivism is the moment to which the kind of hacking kind of spirit became more politicized and became part of a kind of political movement. But the idea behind it, particularly when Anonymous started moving from the lulls, from 4chan, and getting involved in kind of, their own activities and operations and helping out in the Arab Spring, the idea was that they suddenly started providing tools, capabilities. They gave lessons. How do you become anonymous online? What kind of tools can you use? How do you download them? How do you kind of contact us? Why should we use IRC instead of normal kind of browser kind of messaging, etc.? They sent information out to people about how to use tools and how to circumvent blocks through the Arab Spring protests, etc. Why should we care about this? Well, for the very simple reason that we don't know what the future is going to bring. We've already had a revelation about what our current government is doing, but if I said to you what this government is going to be in 20 years' time, you really haven't got much of a clue. You might assume maybe it's going to be Liberal, Labour, Conservative, maybe UKIP, who knows. But the fact is you don't know. And in 20 years' time, there's been another 20 years' worth of data accumulating around you. Now, I say this as well because I've got a 3-year-old son who, at a certain point, they get bored with telly and Peppa Pig, and they notice everyone else is on tablets. So 3 years old, he wanted a tablet. Okay, so he's got a tablet. And he's got apps on it, and it's connected, he plays games, and it's connected to the internet sometimes. And what you realise is, he's got, before he's even an adult, he's got only 13 years worth in front of him of producing data and information, which are going to be harvested by these apps and these companies. Most of you don't know about Flurry Analytics. Flurry Analytics knows about you. Because anyone who produces an app can get for free Flurry Analytics software and install it in their app. And what it does is run in the background if the app is still open, and it collects all the information about either what you're doing with your phone sometimes, or what you're doing with that particular app. Flurry Analytics is probably on most people's phones in this room. They collect something like, I think it's 3 terabytes of data a day. We don't even know about that. And if we don't know about it, we can't debate it, and we can't stop it, and we can't change it, and we can't ask whether it's good, or if it should be happening, or what the democratic possibilities and potentials or threats are, because we don't know about it. And a 3-year-old certainly doesn't know about it. And you're going to have 13 more years before he's even an adult of accumulating data and electronic simulacra about him that at some point could be used. And we know that it can be used in the future. A few years ago, Paris Brown was the Kent Youth Police youth commissioner, and she got the job as a 17-year-old, was immediately forced to resign because of tweets she'd sent when she was 14. Who should be accountable in their present job for what they did and said when they were 14? That is a standard that nobody could survive. But that's the future standard we're all going to have to face. This is a future in which there is a potential for everything we do to remain on record, to be there, to be recoverable, harvestable, to be used against us in ways that I think personally we should be worried about. And let's be clear, the audience didn't have that. The audience weren't even known. Who knows now whether in 1978 I watched The Generation Game or Les Dawson or Benny Hill? Nobody knows. And it doesn't matter. But today, they know, and it potentially matters. So what we have is media studies. And this is speaking from somebody who's always been a bit of a Baudrillardian and McLuhanist and not especially interested in conventional politics. I've become increasingly paranoid. I think from now on, media education and media literacy isn't just a nice thing about how we teach people to kind of like, turn on the TV and interpret films and television. There's something more going on. There is an absolute urgent political project needed today to teach people personal security, anonymization, pattern disruption. What I mean by that is companies are trying to force one identity on you. They're trying to have one identity, no more anonymity, one identity carried across every website. Gmail, if you weren't part of Google+, suddenly you were signed up to Google+, because no one would join Google+, so Google simply rammed the two services together and said you're now part of Google+. And when you sign into YouTube, you now have to sign in using your Gmail account. It's all about forcing one identity on you, because that's where the money and that's where the kind of accountability lies. And there was a case a couple of months ago of a woman who was transgender, and she hadn't realized that Gmail and Google Mail, Gmail and Google Plus had been rammed together. So it was her own mistake, but basically she opened up a message and sent it to her work colleagues, and she accidentally sent it via Google Plus instead of Gmail, which meant she outed herself as transgender to all of her workmates as a result of Google simply changing the repercussions of this. We know that Facebook changed their privacy policy all the time, and it's only ever got more and more kind of broader and more available. What you don't realize is something like Timeline is deadly, because in the past you had to click show older posts and go down kind of like month by month to find anything in the past. Now your mates just click down a slider and everything comes up. And if you put a post on 4 years ago under one set of privacy controls, you don't see it today under those privacy controls, you see it now under new privacy controls, which means that even your levels of privacy you freely chosen are being ripped away from you and transformed because of how the company wants to work. We need to know how to delete ourselves, produce, share, distribute, build networks outside of the mainstream networks like mesh networks, how to crack and penetrate our own technologies, how to evade controls and blocks if we need it. We need to know how to evade traceability and accountability. And that's why media studies is dead. And And I've come to this conclusion now. It is utterly dead. In Alfred Jarry's book, I think Super Male, he's got a bicycle race. And at one point, the two people on the tandem die. But their legs are still going round. Because one leg is going round, the next leg goes round. And actually they get faster and faster. And the two dead people on the tandem actually win the race. It's hysterical. And it's where we are in the discipline. It's simply a kind of dead thing that's still moving forward. And this is a very extreme position, and you can see why now that I kind of don't go down very well and I don't get other jobs. But I'm honest about this. The modules we teach aren't good enough. They're not reflecting the realities of what it means to be a user today. What are you going to put on next year? Are you going to put on MS 101 approaches to text? Or are you going to put on MS 304 surveillance and how to stop it? Well, you're not. You're going to do approaches to text because you've taught it for 20 years and you've got all the nice little pictures and handouts. We don't change our discipline fast enough. And yet actually the reality is changing at such a level, such a pace, that we are utterly, utterly left behind and potentially bankrupt. Most departments can't do it. They can't change the modules they have to teach because they haven't got the staff and they haven't got the knowledge, and quite frankly they're terrified by people like me who come along and say this. And let's be honest, I don't have all these skills. And I'd be happy just teaching kind of Doctor Who and Jean Baudrillard, etc. But you can't. You can't carry on just with stuff that you like in an age like this. And just to kill my career finally, Sonia Livingston, one of the most famous media studies lecturers today, at Bournemouth, 2014, you probably heard this. So let's ask again, where are we? Well, last year was pretty eventful. Leveson, Edward Snowden, PRISM, the BBC Trust, Twitter, big data. Too many wars for journalists to cover. The problems that they neglect or misrepresent, etc. You'll each add your own preoccupations. It's just a preoccupation. For me, it was the Prime Minister reportedly worried about the female vote, not to mention toddlers getting access to an iPad for Christmas, suddenly took up the seemingly marginal question of children's internet safety with unexpected vigour. This is not a pick and mix. In that list, it is not a pick and mix where you go, I quite like that one, I'll have that. This is a multiple choice with one answer, and that answer is Snowden and PRISM. Because that was the biggest single issue in 2013 for media studies. And what is the organised response of media studies as a discipline in Britain? Nothing. A few conferences, a few calls for papers, a few things. There's a few people worried. But no, what do we actually have? This is a genuine call for papers from a couple of weeks ago, a couple of months ago. And you know, I come from a cultural studies background. I'm not going to diss cultural studies because it's important. It's about consumption skills. Cultural objects are valid and they have a social impact, and the more we can understand them and read them, then yes, it's better. But do you know what? It's not as important as the Snowden revelations. There's a time and a place. It's not that this is unimportant. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that, oh, for God's sake, please, dear God, as a discipline, we have to do something more than My Little Pony right now. What we want is a digital media studies dealing with digital realities based around the people who it's actually dealing with, the students and everyday life and ordinary people. We need a media studies that campaigns against contemporary digital developments rather than simply interprets texts. We need a media studies that promotes digital rights, because this is a thing that isn't emphasised enough. Literacy is linked to rights. Now, in the broadcast era, that was occasionally obvious. So if you lived in a totalitarian society, there were things you were not allowed to read or else you'd be arrested. Occasionally, rights and literacy kind of were made clear. But for the most part, in a Western democracy, we kind of got away with the fact that we didn't have to think about that relationship. Today we do. Because absolutely everything you do, your entire ability, either you don't use the technologies or you do. And the moment you do, people can do stuff because of what you do. That can have an effect on you, or it can create value for other people, or it can cause policy changes, etc. Which means in the digital era, digital rights have to be at the forefront of concepts of digital literacy. Tim Berners-Lee has already called for this, an online Magna Carta, a Bill of Rights for the web. It's a kind of direction the media studies needs to be moving into, rather than My Little Pony. Thomas and Jefferson, according to Anonymous, said, when the people fear the government, there is tyranny. When the the government fears the people, there is liberty. Turns out he didn't really say it, it's apparently attributed to John Basil Barnhill, but Anonymous quoted this a lot, and it's a good idea, because at the moment exactly the opposite exists. We have a situation in which the privacy of those in power is almost absolute, and the transparency of the poor, the ordinary people, is almost permanent and almost absolute. We need to shift it so actually power structures are transparent and ordinary people have transparency, and only that way will we have liberty. Media studies needs to become a campaigning organisation and discipline, developing a concept of digital human rights around a core value of individual control of their own data. We need to find a way to get our data back and control it legally against every authority, every company that we can. We need media studies to campaign to change policy rather than put on conferences for themselves about their favourite TV shows. The conclusion comes from a book rather than the paper, but it kind of like sums up some of what I feel. The discipline therefore faces a choice. It has the potential to be one of the most important subject areas going into the 21st century, at the forefront of debates around digital technologies and their remaking of the world. But equally, it's got the possibility of being left behind, is focused on reception and content and broadcast forms and concepts, condemning it to an increasing irrelevance for everyone but itself. Media studies has no necessary right to lead debates on media. It has to fight to prove it understands it better, and has the most effective critical tools to train and guide its students and the public in the future. Final slide. What we need is a discipline able to teach the practical and theoretical skills for digital survival and success. A discipline that would, in the case of Liam Stacey, have prompted the immediate public response, why didn't he do a useful degree such as media instead of choosing a science? We won't arrive at that till we realise the limits of the existing discipline, till we realise that, as McLuhan says, most of our assumptions have outlived their uselessness. And until we realise this uselessness is an opportunity to build what we need. For as McLuhan says, obsolescence never meant the end of anything, it's just the beginning. Thank you for putting up with that. I'm available at the front for tomatoes to be thrown at me.